And in his spare time, Professor Russell raises goats and grapes on his farm in California, which I gather from tonight's weather he wishes he was at. Well, let me introduce our schedule and our order of events for tonight. So it's fairly straightforward. We'll have 20 minutes each for Dr. Spalding and Dr. Russell to present their initial cases for the existence of God and against the existence of God. In between each of those, we'll have 10 minutes for them to interact with each other, to ask questions, and to engage each other. After that 60-minute period, we'll have 10 minutes of closing from each of them to make closing statements and arguments. Drink water, and then we'll return for a lengthy Q&A from the crowd. We do have a microphone to my right and to your left available for questions. I'll repeat this later, but just to let you know up front, we do give you a free minute to go ahead and ask your question, maybe lay that out and explain it a little, but please no counter lectures, please, from the Q&A microphone. So we will cut that out after a minute. We'll do that pleasantly, but I do have a heavy over there who will try to do that for us, just so we can keep the conversation rolling. So with that, I'm glad to welcome Dr. Spalding to the podium for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Family Foundation, for its support of this event. Also for crew. How many crew folks do we have here? Yeah, so we've got lots of crew folks here. And thanks to Professor Russell. It's a real privilege for me to be here on this platform with Dr. Russell. Do you have any high school students here? Let me just see if any high school students. We have a bunch of high school students. I'll tell you what, if you find your way to Wayne State, you need to take a class from Dr. Russell. He will help you think more carefully and critically. It will be department here at Wayne State. And you might not know that the philosophy department here at Wayne State has a very strong and rich history. One of the great philosophers, if you will, or at least problem solver, was a man named Edmund Gettier, and if you look up Edmund Gettier, you'll learn about the Gettier problem, and you'll learn about Wayne State. Another person who's very famous started out here at Wayne State. And so this is a prominent department, the philosophy department here at Wayne State, and Dr. Russell is prominent as well. I mean, I have met people like Doug Guyvett and William Lane Craig. I'm going to give it a go. It's been a real privilege for me in the last number of years to be able to speak at churches and pastors, and I enjoy exploring what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. It's also been a privilege for me to teach here at Wayne State at the Mike Yellard School of Business, where I get to teach, among other things, business ethics. I also get to teach business ethics in a corporate and professional settings, through the Michigan Association of CPAs, the American Institute, and others. And the difference is that when I'm in a church setting, I am transparent about my faith. When I am in a graduate course or a professional seminar, I'm really not as much focused on ethical norms as such, but I'm focused on helping people think about how they arrive at their ethical norms. When I'm involved with Rachel Christie, Student Apologetics Alliance, I get to put the two together. And tonight I get to put the two together. So it's a real privilege for me to be able to do that this evening. My wheelhouse, if you will, is professional ethics. So I'm going to start there, and then we'll move along into the subject of God and the subject at hand. So on the screen you see a sort of North American football goalposts, and it's sort of my little model that I use to when I think about ethics, because generally whenever I ask the question, what is ethics, among the answers I get, the most common one is do the right thing. Of course, then the question is, follow-up question, what is the right thing? That gets to be interesting. How do you know that that's the right thing? And the question of how I come to know, or how I know about what I think I know about right and wrong, is this notion of epistemology, which is a word you heard when you heard John talking about Dr. Russell's expertise. And so when I think about ethics, we want to ask, where does it come from? And so the source of ethics, is it sort of horizontal? Is it something that includes our emotion, sort of gut instinct? I know the right thing because I know it in my gut. Is it human reason? And reason we think of as being sort of pure, but human reason really never is truly pure. In fact, one of my favorite book titles from a person named Stephen Shapin is about science. And it says, Never Pure, Historical Studies of Science as if it was produced by people with bodies situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. So scientists have skin in the game, and so it's difficult to say anything that is done is truly pure reason. Or is it something that we sort of take on as part of our culture, part of our society, how we're raised? Sociologists will tell you that people's ethical values have more to do with their upbringing than just about anything else. And so these are all part of it. And then, of course, there is some theory that our ethics is really something that we got from evolution. It's an instinct. It's a moral instinct, which I sometimes call monkey morality, because evolution is really about surviving and making babies, we can stop there. We could stop there if we wanted to truncate our... Can't help but think about, where does God fit into all of this? And in fact, that's a good question, because when we think about ethics, we think about moral principles, we think about higher moral values, and the more vertical we go, the more we sort of find ourselves moving in the direction of thinking about God. One of my favorite atheist writers is Jean-Paul Sartre, who acknowledged that the atheist finds it extremely embarrassing that God doesn't exist, because there disappears with God all possibility of finding values. There can no longer be any good a priori, since there is no, and here's his wonderful definition of God, there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it. And then he goes on to talk about sacred text. There is nowhere written that the good exists. So he also goes on to talk about sort of a famous aphorism that comes from Dostoevsky, and that aphorism is, let's get to it here, there it is, without God, everything is permitted. So when we think about ethics, we can't help but sort of going vertical a little bit. And that, in fact, moves us in the direction of what we could call God consciousness. Because if we don't have that, if all we're doing is working plain, if that's all we have, then thing comes from God. So what I'm talking about that in terms of objective morality. I also want to talk about it in terms of God consciousness. Most people are here tonight because they have some sense of God consciousness. Even if you think of yourself as an atheist or an agnostic, you can't be sure. And you have to ask yourself, is there something out there that tells me that God does exist? And I don't know why that nice bass drum sound keeps coming up every once in a while, but I feel like I'm at a rock concert or something. But one can't be completely sure. Peter Singer was here on this campus. In fact, he was joined by Dr. Russell on a debate panel. And I heard Peter Singer one time say that one can never totally exclude the possibility, I suppose, that there is a God. But it seems to me so improbable that I'm prepared to call myself an atheist. Jacques Derrida, an atheist, did the same thing. He said, I rightly pass for an atheist, but he wouldn't actually claim it. Even Richard Dawkins, when asked about, what confidence level do you have, and he said, well, if on a scale of 1 to 7, belief in God, belief that there is no God, I'm maybe about a 6. There is this notion that we have about omnipresence, which bothers us a little bit. If God is everywhere, he's here right now, that's kind of troubling. His sovereignty, his justice, his love, his personhood. And that God consciousness, or sensus divinitatis, as it was called by two people whose names don't show up in the same sentence very often, John Calvin and Thomas Aquinas, both refer to this sensus divinitatis, and Dr. Russell has had some things to say about that as well. So God consciousness, I'm going backwards here, God consciousness is another thing that can be known about God, that triggers our thinking about God. Another one is just mere existence, the fact that anything exists at all. This notion of sort of nothing comes from nothing, nothing ever could. This no matter how they try, they ask, but it's still something. It's not nothing. And so that leads us to kind of thinking writ large, known for a lot of things, including being a TV star, was asked the question, he said, we asked the question, why is it that we and the universe exist? If we find the answer to that, it would be the ultimate triumph of human reason, for then we would know the mind of God. Stephen Hawking, then we would know the mind of God. The mind of God, 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 God. The mind of God, 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 God. It echoes. The mind of God. And that's what we think about when we think about existence. And the mind of God is also what kind of informs us about our own consciousness. We make intentional, volitional choices. We purpose our way through life. And that volition, that heart, that sense of choice is what makes us who we are, and it makes us accountable for who we are. In law, we don't convict someone for a serious crime unless there is what's called mens rea, unless there is volition. And that intentionality is something that psychologists and psychology theorists have a lot of problems with. Sir Karl Popper, who was an agnostic, said that the emergence of full consciousness is indeed one of the greatest miracles. We also have from the mind of God the notion of biological information. And so that we know we're made up of an information system. We know that we have 3.1 billion bits of information in our DNA. And so we have even the very person who discovered the genetic code, agnostic or atheist, depending on the day of the week that he would talk with, Francis Crick, said, an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So we have the mind of God sort of informing DNA and informing information. We also have the mind of God informing physics. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner for quantum electrodynamics, said, why nature is mathematical is a mystery. The fact is that there are rules, the fact that there are physics rules at all is a miracle. And so, wait a minute, didn't I just say miracle? Didn't I just say the word miracle out of the mouths of several atheists? That's fun. I love it when atheists use the word miracle, but they're using it in reference to consciousness, to biological information, to the laws of physics. Argument, if we talk about God consciousness, that's sort of personal. If we talk about consciousness, biological information, laws of physics, that's sort of evidentiary. Then we have historical. We have this historical event called resurrection. And Gary Habermas, whose father actually taught here at Wayne State at one point, earned his PhD at Michigan State University, not known for his theological prowess, crucifixion, that there was an empty tomb, that people reported seeing the risen Christ, and the explosive growth of the Christian church, all of which are acknowledged by the enemies of Christianity back in the early days. And he said that's evidence, that is a miracle. And when we talk about a miracle, we have to acknowledge evidence of God. There's also this idea of existential dread, this idea that we go through life focusing on our rathers that are beyond our reach. We'd rather have approval and acceptance. We'd rather have significance. We'd rather have power and control. We'd rather have comfort. We'd rather have sexual arousal and fulfillment. We'd rather have the next level of prowess on our video games. We'd rather have true intimacy in our relationships. We long for meaning in life, and yet the paradox of hedonism is the more we try to go after those things, the more we try to grab them, the more they're beyond our reach. And so that, once again, puts us in kind of a bind where we have to find ourselves asking, where, God, where are you, and are you? And when we do that, it's very personal. We almost pray this prayer from thousands of years ago. Why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? So then we think about God. And when we think about God, and we think about his omnipresence, we think about his sovereignty, we think about his justice, we get a little bit worried. God's standard of holiness and righteous is a little fully perfect God who creates the cosmological constant to the 100 terrifying. What do we do about that? And so it's a reality check. If God exists, God is holy and righteous. God exists. I've already gone through some of the indicators of God's existence. God is holy and righteous. If God is, then if I begin to develop a sense of who God is, that's good. Now I've got reality. Now I've got truth going for me. And I'm better off than I was before. But I'm going to give you lots of reasons to reject God, and I'm not going to rebut them later on. So let me just rattle through them. Who wants to fear God? Who wants to subject ourselves to a ruler, to a king? Who wants to be accountable? Who wants to be worried about going to hell? Who wants to be ashamed if God is present and seeing me at all times in the presence of God's eyes? Who needs that? Who wants to be subjected to absolutist moral values? Who wants to have limits on their life choices? There are lots of reasons to reject God and ways to do it. We can demand more evidence. Richard Dawkins one time was asked a question. He said, what if there was a 900-foot Jesus with a voice like Paul Robeson who showed up in front of you? Would you believe then? And he said, I don't know. Which reminds me of exactly what happened to the risen Christ in Matthew when they knew that Christ had risen from the dead, and he's walking around. People are really, they're worshiping him. And then Matthew 28:17, some doubted. So that's going to happen. We can demand more evidence. We can ignore the evidence. We can discount the evidence. We can redact the evidence. We can deny the evidence. We can disconfirm the evidence. And I'm going to leave that to Dr. Russell to handle all of that. But I want to ask, if you don't want to reject God, if you don't want to reject God, what do you do? How do you get back to God? And let me tell you what won't work. Reasoning with God won't work. I was at a Taekwondo test one time, and there was this great big guy and a 12-year-old, and the 12-year-old was testing for a yellow belt, and the big guy said, don't hit below the belt. What did that kid do? Boom, right below the belt, There was not a lot of reasoning with that kid when that happened. You don't reason with God. And I just blocked it out. Okay, so that doesn't work. You can't negotiate with the almighty sovereign Lord of the universe. Our righteousness doesn't work either. God's not impressed. You go to a judge, a person is convicted of a crime, and they're standing there at the sentencing hearing, and they're saying, or their mother is saying, or somebody's saying, oh, but this person was so good. They scooted to the middle at the conference so that people could sit. I mean, it did everything. And the judge is like, yeah, so, you're convicted. And our religious efforts won't work. Religious efforts is just, the way I pray, what I eat, what I wear, how I go about my business, who I hang with. It's good stuff, but it doesn't impress God. because it's just another way of trying to negotiate with God. So that's not going to work either. So there's lots of reasons to reject God and lots of ways to not get back to God. Thank you.
How's that? Can you hear me? So, I'm a little unclear about some things. I'm not quite sure what the arguments are, the evidence is that Byrd has offered for belief in God or the existence of God. One line of argument seems to be about what are the origins of ethics, about right and wrong. And you might think that I'm some sort of subjectivist about ethics, but you'd be quite wrong. I think that ethics are as objective as mathematics. So I want to ask you, Bert, what would you say if somebody asked you the question, what are the origins of mathematics?
Am I on? Yeah, good. I would mathematics, like logic, like the very ability for you to ask the question, comes from a higher mind, comes from a higher consciousness. So mathematics is created. It doesn't just exist. It's created. The laws of physics are created. Your ability to reason is created because it didn't arrive as a result of evolution. Evolution teaches you to kill truth. It delivers dominance. And so I look to a creator.
Well, I wonder it's not just about our ability to, say, discover mathematical truths I'm asking about. It's not how do we discover that 2 plus 2 is 4, but I wonder about the proposition 2 plus 2 is 4. To me, that's a kind of truth that's independent of us or God's existence, that if God didn't exist, 2 plus 2 equals 4 would still be true. So I think the question about origins of mathematics doesn't make sense. And I say the same thing about morality, that genocide and rape and child molestation would be wrong, regardless of whether there's a God or not.
Well, there's two points that you're offering, I think. Let me try to capture both of them. Going back to mathematics, you said 2 plus 2 is going to be 4 always, at all times. That's sort of, it's almost a Euthyphro problem. It sort of is outside of God or above God, right? I mean, is that
outside of everything.
Outside.
If we didn't exist,
Right.
2 plus 2 would be
Okay.
4.
And you know, I can't believe I'm going to do this, but I'm actually going to I'm going to talk about the multiverse. Usually theists aren't real excited about talking about multiverses. But you know, an atheist or a philosopher who would talk about other universes and other worlds would not necessarily agree with you that 2 plus 2 is 4, that holds true in that chaotic in some other multiverse. So there is at least some notion that the clarity of 2 plus 2 equals 4, we think of that as truth. We approach that using the logic that we have as a result of our Creator, but it is the Creator that provides the logic and the Creator that provides that truth. You also asked about objective morality, and I would say this. Rape is wrong, but rapists rape. Genocide is wrong, but dictators, and I'm not even going to be gratuitous and say atheist dictators, but dictators commit genocide. So what is wrong to Dr. Bruce Russell is apparently not authoritative with Kim Il-jung or some other dictator. So So it's really a theoretical offering that you have is, well, I think this is wrong, unless there is a higher moral principle that you can draw down and point to and say, that's the wrongness right there. There's good and evil. And I can't tell you about the evil. I'm pointing backwards at my shadow here. I can't tell you about the evil unless I can point to the light and to the sun. Then I can tell you the differentiation between good and evil. Otherwise, I'm just making it up as I go along. I think this is wrong. Well, you know, what about if someone is flirting? Is that wrong? I mean, we're on a scale. And I know you would say, well, it's obvious. It's obvious to you, but it's not an objective standard.
I can't quite get it yet. I think there's a sense in which God might provide, you could have a view that God provides us the ability, reason to reason logically, but I don't think God makes validity arguments valid or invalid. It's just a matter of fact. If you have an argument that goes if P then Q, P so Q, it's a valid argument no matter whether God exists or I exist or you exist or anyone. And it goes through all of those kinds of logical and mathematical truths, and I don't see why, of course, there are people in the world who don't believe all of these mathematical truths, and there are people in the world who don't believe that genocide is wrong. I don't see how that cuts any ice about whether there is an objective truth about genocide and mathematics. And you could, in principle, I mean, maybe not, maybe so, know the difference between right and wrong without actually encountering them. But suppose I grant you can't. That just means in order to have the concepts, you have to have some experience. But once you acquire the relevant concepts, then it follows necessarily that 2 + 2 is 4 and the like. So I think you confuse how we get access through our reason to these necessary truths with the independent existence of the necessary truths.
You know, it's kind of like driving a Grand Cherokee and saying, I don't believe there's a factory that makes Grand Cherokee there. You're using logic, which is itself does not emerge from nature. It emerges from in the passenger seat.
It makes me think that this idea that it derives from a higher source, so Q, he could have made it invalid. That seems to be anything else but for a natural being to make the truths of logic and mathematics. We use logic to find there's a source 9 command theories have about ethics. The famous Euthyphro dilemma, in principle, to me that sounds like he could command 2 + 2 = 5 and make it true. That is impossible.
It is impossible. God is not.
To obey.
He is logic. He is mean that there's a source, but it doesn't mean there doesn't. It doesn't mean there isn't a source in the Q and the this and the that. There's in the Trinitarian view of God, God is 3 persons. He is the source of how we construct these structures. All there is with
that God is the source of logic and mathematics and morality, unless it means that he is a contradiction. He could not, because God, the way I understand it, equal 5, he can't make this argument form I gave.
Done?
Time.
Okay, thanks.
Dr. Russell, we invite you up to the podium for 20 minutes.
How's this? You hear me again? Okay, so I want to thank Bert for, he was instrumental in organizing this debate, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity. And I thank him for the kind and generous remarks he made about me and the philosophy department when he was here at the podium. I have a handout. Do all of you have it? Okay, good. It reminds me when I was a graduate student at UC Davis teaching one of my first philosophy courses, and I got evaluations back at the end of the term, and one of them I treasure, but I've lost it, but I haven't forgot it. And he said, or the person said, I don't know, it was he or she, "This is the worst class I've ever taken in the university. There was nothing but one argument after another." Yep. So here we go. So do I have to step back or what? I'm going to assume that the God that I'm going to talk about and argue does not exist, or there's reason to believe that God does not exist, is a God who's all-knowing, all-powerful, and wholly good. Those three attributes are generally assumed in discussions I have about the existence of God. It's assumed by three of the major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that God has those properties. He may, or I'll say he, sometimes I'll say she, have more, but that's enough for my argumentative purposes here. So I will start by offering the problem of evil, a famous problem against the existence of God, which is an argument that says God would not allow suffering or unnecessary suffering or way too much unnecessary suffering, and concludes that God does not exist because there is such suffering. There's an awful lot of suffering of innocent people and animals in the world. When I teach philosophy of religion, I look in the Detroit Free Press for examples. First time I published an article about a little girl in Flint who was on New Year's Eve in 1989, was brutally raped, beaten, and then strangled to death by the mother's boyfriend, or at least that was the suspect. His lawyer actually got him off, so he didn't do any jail time. There's a famous case of Ariana Swinson in 2000 where her parents threw her on the floor and because she wasn't eating properly, and then drowned her by pouring boiling water down her throat. And more recently, discovered in 2015, Michelle Blair killed two of her children by putting a bag over their head and beating them, and then put first in 2012 her son in the freezer. Then she killed her daughter in 2013 and put her in the freezer, except she had her other daughter, an older daughter, put the second person, the first daughter, in the freezer. And so they were there for several years, and they were discovered in 2015 when people were evicting her from her house. And then, of course, there are the kind of big cases, the Holocaust, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Armenian genocide, Rwanda, all the suffering, death from tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods, droughts, genetic diseases, and the like. There seems to be plenty of suffering to go around. There are three versions of the problem of evil. I'm going to go through a couple and say they're not sound. And then I'm going to settle on one that I think is sound. The first one goes, if God exists, there would be no suffering of innocence, but clearly there is, so God doesn't exist. And I'm going to skip down to the replies and do it that way. So the reply to this first argument is to be able to act of our own free will, to have opportunity to do good or bad, is a great good in itself. Free will is a good, not only free will, the opportunity to act on our free will. So a good God would want his creatures to have this significant freedom, but they may misuse it and create suffering, so suffering is compatible with the existence of God. Further, some suffering is needed if certain virtues are to develop: compassion, mercy, forgiveness, perseverance, courage, etc. Better to have some suffering and the possibility of these virtues than neither. So for both these reasons, premise 1A is false. Suffering is compatible with the existence of God. That is a good objection. They're right. Second version goes, if God exists, he would not allow the unnecessary suffering of innocence. I give the example in my classes: a dentist can cause some suffering by giving an injection of an anesthetic before he drills the child's tooth, but it's not unnecessary. It's necessary to prevent further suffering later on. but suppose he says, oh no, I'm not going to do that, I'm just going to drill the tooth. This is a bunch of suffering, unnecessary, and if you were a parent and were standing by and could stop it, you would be allowing unnecessary suffering. And of course, you'll think about that dentist and the parent who doesn't stop him, they are not good people. So, the second argument goes, if God exists, he would not allow the unnecessary suffering of innocence, that is, would not allow that unless allowing it was needed to bring about some greater good or prevent some greater bad. But there is unnecessary suffering of innocence, so God does not exist. The reply to this is in 3b below there. To the second version of the problem of evil, here's an example. Peter Van Inwagen, a philosopher at Notre Dame in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, used against me. Imagine that there are 1,000 people on Atlantis, which is sinking, and a good ship's captain can save many by taking them aboard his ship. But for each person he puts aboard, the chance that the ship will sink increases by 0.1%. So if he puts all 1,000 aboard, his ship will definitely sink. If he takes none aboard, they will all drown on Atlantis as it goes under. Van Inwagen says that a good captain must take at least a handful, say 10, and may take all but a handful, say 990. Still, if he takes just a handful, he may leave some behind that he could have saved. They will suffer unnecessarily when they drown. Could have taken them aboard. But according to Van Inwagen, the good captain does no wrong if he leaves them behind. So a good captain could allow unnecessary suffering. If that's true of a good captain, why not of a good God? So premise 1b, this objection says, is false. My first response is, it's not an apt example because the captain has an excuse in that he's non-culpably ignorant of how many he can take aboard and still make it safely to port. But God does not have this excuse. He would know exactly how many to take aboard. None would be left behind unnecessarily. But I think Van Inwagen has a more sophisticated argument in that same reply that this one, the captain passage is from, that assumes there's no minimum amount of suffering that must be allowed to bring about some greater good or avoid some greater evil that reaches the same conclusion as his captain's analogy. Rather than taking time to discuss it now, for the sake of argument, I'll just grant it that it's sound and skip to the third version of the problem of evil. So the third version, turned back, is if God exists, he would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering. There's another example that Van Inwagen gives about a judge who could deter this crime at the relevant level by imposing a 364-day sentence, but he imposes 365, and that's still not unjust or not wrong that a good judge could do that. Yeah, but what if he imposed a life sentence for stealing from a convenience store? That would be excessive sentence. That's what I'm worried about, excessive unnecessary suffering. And that's what argument 3 says. 1c, if God exists, he would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering of innocence. That is, would not allow way more suffering than need be allowed to bring about some greater good or prevent some greater bad. So now what do I say? What do they say about this argument, the critics? And I say, I don't think they can criticize 1c. That one is a necessary truth, that it's true even if God exists or not, like 2 + 2 is 4. So that's what I say about 1c. I don't think you can think of a counterexample to it, but we'll have Q&A, maybe you can. So what I do say is that now the focus is not on the first premise, but on the second one. what reason is there to think that there is this excessive, unnecessary suffering that's crucial, that I assert is the case in premise 2? Well, you might think I gave plenty of examples right at the beginning of my talk about, all of that suffering in Detroit. You just look in the Free Press and the Holocaust, that's quite a bit of suffering. But that's not enough. Here's an argument, or here's a criticism, actually, I should start with, of premise 2. Theodicies try to show that premise 2 is false. It says there is excessive unnecessary suffering. Theodicies try to say, no, that's false. There is not. I don't think they're going to be successful. I think a lot of philosophers of religion have abandoned theodicies. They can show, as I did when I was criticizing premise 1a, that God would allow some suffering, and because of free will and an opportunity to develop certain virtues, I don't think anybody can explain why there's so much. There's a lot of suffering that's not needed for having significant freedom or to develop the virtues. That I don't think works. The new wrinkle is to offer a defense which says we're in no position to judge whether premise 2 is true or false. We should suspend judgment about premise 2 is the new response. And I say, well, here's a problem. There are people I imagine I call young earthers, and I use the word YES, young earthers with an S, many, that they say something, they have a defense of their view that's similar to the defense that I just sketched, that the skeptical theists. I should go through skeptical theists. Here's the defense. Why do they think we're no in position to judge? First, because there may be goods and bads of which God is aware that are beyond our grasp, beyond our ken, as the skeptical theists often say. So maybe God is to allow all the suffering of innocence that we observe in order to bring about these goods or avoid these bads. Secondly, whether there are goods and bads beyond our ken or not, God may see how allowing all the suffering of innocence that we observe is necessary to bring about these goods and avoid these bads. And this complex path is not accessible to our finite minds. So the conclusion from 1 and 2 is we are in no position to judge that the suffering of innocence we observe is excessive and unnecessary. That's the skeptical theist's basic defense. And the young earthers say this. They say that the world was created recently, 5,000 years ago, 100 years ago, 5 minutes ago. Bertrand Russell imagined once, hey, how do we know that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago with all the signs of age and you people looking like you're older than 5 minutes and so forth? Possible. And with all the signs of age like fossils, deep river valleys, cave paintings, and so on, and with books and human artifacts that seem old but were also created recently. God did this, here's the young earther story, so we could learn the lessons of history without all the suffering a real history would involve. We can learn about the physical world through the science texts we have. For when God did create the world recently, he created it with all the regularities recounted in the scientific books. And we can learn how to better to live together by reading stories of how people have gone wrong and how right in their interactions. God wanted people to come into existence as prepared as they now are, but without the suffering that would be involved if they really had to acquire this knowledge through a real history. Deception's prima facie wrong, but can be all things considered right if it's needed to avoid terrible suffering and produce great good. The young earthers do not claim to grasp all of God's reasons for doing what he did, say for creating the world just when he did, rather than earlier or later. But like skeptical theists who respond to the problem of evil, they say that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. What do the skeptical theists say to the young earthers? Here's their argument. If young eartherism is true, then the world was created recently. But the world was not created recently, so young earthism is false. But the young earthers reply, but we argue that no one is in a position to judge that 2 is false. We give the same kind of argument that you, the skeptical theists, give against the problem of evil. You say there's a reason why God would allow some suffering, namely significant freedom and opportunity to develop the virtues, and then we have reason to think that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. We argue, we young earthers, that there's reason why God would deceive us to lessen suffering while at the same time providing us with useful knowledge. And we have reason to think that some of God's reasons are beyond our ken. Our defenses have the same structure, an appeal to some human good we humans can understand to explain in part why the world would appear as it does if God exists, and then an appeal to God's having reasons beyond our ken to explain why certain aspects of the world are a puzzle to us. So much suffering of innocence or all the signs of age, respectively. Here's what Bruce Russell says. If the skeptical theist argument against the problem of evil is a good defense, then the young earthers' defense against the skeptical theist argument I listed above is also a good defense. But the young earthers' defense is not a good defense against the skeptical theist arguments. Obviously, it's really not reasonable to believe that the world was created recently. So, the skeptical theist defense isn't a good defense. What is a positive argument for my claim that there's excessive, unnecessary suffering? All I've tried to do so far is to show you that the skeptical theist defense isn't so hot, because it's just like the young earthers' defense, and we all know that one's not so hot. What's my positive argument? It goes like this. The best explanation of apparently excessive, unnecessary suffering, think about the Holocaust and all that stuff I listed at the beginning, we observe is that there is such suffering, not that there's an immaterial God that mysteriously is able to act on the physical world and has reasons beyond our ken for creating it and allowing all the suffering of innocence we observe. We should believe premise 2 because it's the best explanation of what we observe. Could there be, the last section is, can the God hypothesis, the idea that God exists, explain other things that atheism cannot? I've already talked in the exchange with Bert why I think you don't need God to explain objective morality. Objective morality is like math, and you don't need God to explain why math truths are necessary truths, true in every possible world. 2 + 2 is 4, genocide is wrong, they're on a par. How about events or things in the universe, like the structure of the human eye or animal anatomy? These were the kinds of things that people who offered the design argument in the past would focus upon and argue from there to a designer. I think that those events or structures or things in the universe are going to be able to be given scientific explanations. That's what happened with the design argument when Darwin came along and said, wait a minute, I have a non-theistic argument for the origin and structure of the eye. I think every event in the universe promises to be in the universe explained by science. And the success of science in doing that is my reason for drawing that conclusion. Finally, I think the best move for the theist is not to look to explain things with the God hypothesis in the universe, but to explain features of the universe itself. How about the fact that there is a universe, existence? Bert suggested this at one point. Why is there something rather than nothing? Some people say that's a fundamental question in metaphysics, and you naturalists can't answer it, but we God folks can. How about that? Or how about the fundamental laws of nature? What explains that? Or
That's
fine-tuning, that if you didn't have the fundamental constants just like they were, we wouldn't have any life or no intelligent life. All those things are universe properties. My answer is that God hypothesis seems a good one at first glance for the features of the entire universe. But here I finish up. There's a problem. This explanation is only deceptively good. What's the problem with it? It introduces mysterious causal relations between an immaterial being, here's an immaterial being, and the physical world. How does that happen? It's a famous problem in Descartes. How would a soul interact with our brains? He said at the pineal gland. That wasn't the answer. The question was not where,
Time is up.
how. Two more?
No, we're done.
We're done?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just pick, yeah, the mic's on the floor. There we go. All right, Dr. Spalding, you have 10 minutes to interact with
Thank you
Dr.
very
Russell.
much.
Give
Well, I'm
him
learning a
moment.
lot of things today. First of all, I'm learning how to get an extra 2 minutes on my speech, so I try to do that maybe, I don't know. Thank you, Dr. Russell, for that careful analysis. And I wonder about the young earther thing. Isn't that really an appeal to possibility? X is possible, therefore young earthers think X is true, and I'm just wondering how helpful that is if it confuses possible with the probable.
Where's the possibility part you're thinking about?
You're saying that young earthers think that it's possible that God created the earth 5 minutes ago, therefore they think it's true.
I'm just saying they follow the exact same reasoning that the skeptical theists do. Namely, there are two parts of the skeptical theist reasoning. Here's a reason why we can explain some things in the universe, like some suffering, by appealing to God, the value of free will, and God's wanting to create creatures with free will and so forth. And we skeptical theists can explain something by the God hypothesis, namely why he really created it recently, because he wanted to make sure that creatures came into existence, us, with a certain kind of useful knowledge, which was not based on an actual history, but on a history implanted in us. And the reason he did this is for two: one, it's useful, and two, it avoids all the suffering that occurred if there was an actual history as we think there is. So those are the reasons why God, wanting to have people minimize their suffering at the same time having important knowledge, created the universe recently. It's not just that it's possible. This is our explanation of, given God's goodness, why he would want to have knowledge and avoid suffering. So,
I mean, we have, there's the possibility and there's the probability. We have, even Alvin Plantinga said, a brain in a vat exercise is not properly basic, because we know we've been around for more than 5 minutes. So I just don't see the helpfulness of the appeal to possibility. But even if that logic makes some sense, you refer to it as skeptical theism, which I know a lot of people do. I think of it as big God theism. God is so large and so omniscient, I can't know what God knows. And if that is a proper stance, if that's agnosticism, then it doesn't follow, does it, that seemingly pointless suffering affirms atheism over theism.
what doesn't follow? Say that again.
If you disconfirm the evidence of God by using this very tight little box of an argument, if you claim to disconfirm the evidence of God, that doesn't then in turn affirm atheism.
So there are two parts to this. So I first give a positive argument. Those are the versions of the problem of evil. And of course, I settle on the third version because I think the third version's first premise is not criticizable in the way that the other two versions were. So that's my positive argument for the non-existence of God. The next step is I'm trying to meet an objection to one of the premises in my positive argument, namely premise 2. And my appeal to the analogy of the young earthers is to say, wait a minute, your criticism of premise 2 can't be a good one because the young earthers can mount the same kind of criticism with the same structure as your criticism of my premise 2. And we all know that the skeptical theist criticism isn't any good. Skeptical theist, defense of their view, I should say, isn't any good. So by analogy, by parallel reasoning, yours isn't either. So now I think I've rescued the problem of evil, and what I haven't given so far at this stage is a positive argument for its second premise. The critics were trying to criticize it. I met their criticism, or attempted to, and now I give, in the last part of that section, my own positive inference to the best explanation argument for the second premise. So the argument for God's non-existence is that basic one that I gave right at the outset, the third version.
Okay. So I'm thinking about what we don't know about God, because God is omniscient and we are not, and what we do know about suffering in the absence of God. So we don't know all of the reasons for suffering and evil. We're not God. We don't have a God's eye view. We do know that there are many times, even in our experience, we know there are many times when it seems if something was meant for evil and it turns out to be something that has a good outcome. We know that happens. So there's a lot we don't know about the ultimate purpose of suffering when it comes to theism. That's skeptical theism, as you designated. I call it big God theism. But what we do know about the ultimate purpose of suffering with atheistic evolution is that we do know that there is natural evil, pain, suffering, disease, death, extinction, that these are constitutive of life. They're parts of the biological process. So evil is assumed. It really becomes the problem of goodness, that the universe that we, as Dawkins said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties that we should expect is if there was no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. In other words, there's no good and evil, but ultimate indifference. So atheism offers us indifference to suffering. Theism shines a light on it and asks us to worry about suffering, just as you have with all these examples of the young children and the mothers and all of that. That actually is because light is shining down and we're looking at the shadow and we understand there's both good and evil. Atheism doesn't offer you any distinction between good and evil. It's just a natural process. It happens all by itself.
Well, the fact that it's a natural process or the outcome of a natural process doesn't mean it's not good, sometimes good things, like people, I don't know, are saved or made happy or something, or they're injured by the tsunami or killed. That it's an outcome of a natural process doesn't mean that it doesn't have moral value or disvalue. Of course, I'm an objectivist about these things about good and bad and right and wrong. So, of course, I say it's a bad thing if the tsunami or the earthquakes or whatever kill and cause a lot of people to suffer, and a good thing if somehow people are saved from these kinds of events and they're all natural occurrences. So I think that an atheist can well recognize value in the universe. The problem for the theist is there seems to be too much suffering, given that there's a good God who knows about it, has the power to prevent it, and doesn't.
Too much suffering by the measuring stick of Dr. Russell.
Measuring stick of what?
By the measuring stick of Dr. Russell. Let me ask it this way. If the tri-omni God, all good, all powerful, all knowing, of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were to exist, as you would put it, is it in your view an analytical truth that such a God would not allow excessive unnecessary suffering?
Yeah.
Okay. So then, are you saying, irrespective of all the purported evidence for God and any and all irrespective of all the other purported evidence for God, much of which I went through, and I only went through a half a dozen, as you know, there's another half a dozen at least that are traditionally used. Irrespective of all that evidence, any and all unnecessary excessive suffering is evidential disconfirmation of the existence of God.
Yeah, you know, I recently published a paper where I address what's called the G.E. Moore shift, because the G.E. Moore shift in this context says, look, we're going to agree with you, Russell, on 1C, that if God exists, there's not excessive unnecessary suffering. And we're going to argue, and God does exist, and so there's really not unnecessary excessive suffering. And I said, okay, good try. Okay, what is your argument now that God exists? I didn't think that any of the considerations you gave actually were sufficient reason to believe God exists. That we have God consciousness, maybe so. Probably there's a psychological, biological explanation why we have God consciousness. That we have existential dread. There's also a psychological explanation for that. So I don't see that any of the considerations you raise actually supports the premise God exists. You could, in principle, try this G.E. Moore shift to argue, the argument form I have is if P then Q, not Q, so not P. Somebody might try if P then Q, P, so Q. That is, there really isn't excessive unnecessary suffering. I just think that route, I haven't heard the arguments yet that is going to convince me that it's more reasonable to believe that God exists than it's reasonable to believe that there's excessive unnecessary suffering.
Okay, time up. Dr. Russell will come up. We're at the closing part of our discussion, our presentation tonight. So Dr. Russell will go first to present for 10 minutes, and then Dr. Spalding will close with 10 minutes, and then we'll take a break and come back for questions and answers.
So I guess what I'll do, because I was rushing through my last sort of Roman numeral, that I'll finish up with that. And the issue is, so let me go over just what I think the big structure, I kind of was outlining it when I was talking to Bert here at this 10-minute interchange, that I think, okay, I've finally given an argument, the problem of evil argument, that God doesn't exist. The skeptical theists say I'm in no position to judge. It's true, the second premise, that there is excessive unnecessary suffering. I tried to meet their criticism by saying, but by analogy, the young earthers could give the same kind of defense of their view, but we all know that defense isn't any good. But the skeptical theist defense against the problem of evil, my second premise, has exactly the same structure as the young earthers. So if their defense, the young earthers, isn't good, neither is the skeptical theist. This is supposed to then say, now I've got this argument back, it hasn't been defeated, and somebody might say, well, okay, the criticism of your second premise hasn't succeeded, but you haven't given any argument for it. And then I gave the inference to the best explanation argument for my second premise, saying the best explanation of apparently excessive unnecessary suffering is the very simple explanation there is. At the end, I said that I don't think that any theistic argument's going to work, but the most promising ones are the ones that look at features of the entire universe, not events or things or states of affairs in the universe, like the human eye or animal anatomy, but properties of the universe itself. Why does it exist rather than not? Why do we have the laws that we have rather than not some others? And so forth. And I started to say about that, and I'll return to this, that those arguments, that God hypothesis seems promising to answer these questions, but if you dig deeper and see what kind of explanation it is, you'll see where it fails. And where it fails is it introduces mysterious connections between an immaterial being and the physical world. How is it possible that an immaterial being can act on the physical world? How is it possible, people worried Descartes about, that an immaterial soul can affect the brain? That's one problem with the God hypothesis. A second one is it introduces mysterious reasons beyond our ken for why God allows so much terrible suffering of innocence. And it's not just mystery that we might penetrate. We don't know the causes of cancer, but we don't think that they're essentially mysterious. But this mystery of God, mysterious reasons, because of his infinite mind, is impenetrable in principle to humans. That is a flaw in a hypothesis, that you have to introduce mystery at least in two places. Furthermore, I say, I didn't get to this, but one reason that theists give, claiming the superiority of their hypothesis, is it doesn't allow any brute facts, where the naturalists have to say, there are some brute facts, we have the universe we do, say, with the laws we do. That's an unexplainable fact. But they also have brute facts. The brute fact is that God chose to create this universe rather than one equally good, but not this universe. Why did he choose this one, where he could have chosen another at least equally good universe? So my conclusion is there is a very strong argument against the God that the kind of God I was addressing, all-knowing, all-powerful, and wholly good. It's called the problem of evil. And I gave that argument. I defended against criticisms. I defended then all of the premises, including the second one. And then at the end of my talk, I said, you know, the God hypothesis looks pretty good at first blush about explaining features of the universe that naturalists have a difficult time explaining. But if you press that God hypothesis, it dissolves in your hands. That explanation has all the flaws that I just mentioned in my concluding remarks. Thanks.
Copy of my slides. Thank you, Dr. Russell. How is it possible that an immaterial being can interact with the material world? Dr. Russell, his name is Jesus Christ. An immaterial being, God, interacting with the material world. It's called incarnation. And it is actually the essence of all creation. God spoke creation into existence, and the Word was made flesh. I want to go back to one point that Dr. Russell made about big God theism or skeptical theism. And I just want to say that we don't know that it's always preferable for God to intervene, interrupt, and intercede on when bad things would happen. There's actually a book in the Bible called the Book of Judges, and every time God did intercede and things went well, the wheels fell off morally and spiritually with them. Human nature being what it is, when things are too comfortable, we tend to rebel even more than otherwise would be the case. I'm going to close this. Let me just get to my closing thing. I'm going to close with just a quick review, first of all. What can be known about God is plain. Dr. Russell basically said, I haven't proven this or I haven't proven that about these different arguments and evidences, and you're right, I haven't, because I said they infer, they signal, they tell us about God. And so the question is all the signals of transcendence, the opportunities for inference. Well, actually, God consciousness is not inference. God consciousness is direct sense of God's existence and presence. But the ones that are evidential, the question is the one argument that Dr. Russell makes, which is his preference for God to intervene and intercede and prevent certain levels of evil, as opposed to allowing for there to be a distance between man and God and allowing man to want to seek God, that's preferable to justice. I was an IRS agent. The IRS and law enforcement agencies know that you want to make an example of someone, and that does a lot more for deterrence than interception and interruption. So the script that I would flip is if God exists, there wouldn't be any pointless suffering, number one. Number two, God exists. We have objective morality, God consciousness, something from coming from nothing, not coming from nothing, consciousness, but biological information, the laws of physics, the history giving us the resurrection, existential dread. God exists, so there's no pointless suffering. And that's flipping the script on his presentation. What can be known about God? God's eternal power and divine nature are plain. If we wanted to go through all of the different arguments talking about intelligent design, we would just be awestruck at the precision of the creation and DNA and the lining up of the planets, the fact that the Earth is positioned perfectly in order to see out and to learn about the rest of the universe. And that is basically what I'm going to do in the last 4 minutes that I have, is to talk about what the Bible has to say, because the Bible is, there's a genre of literature called romance novels. I know it's kind of out of date, but it's still a $50 million industry today. What's the basic theme of a romance novel? Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl. There you have it. The Bible is not a novel. It's a romance nonfiction. And it's human, or if creation meets creator, creation rebels against creator, and creator finds a way for redemption. That's the story of the Bible. But to get there, we have to understand that there is an opportunity for us to learn about God. For what can be known about God is plain. I've been saying that in my presentations, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his internal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that they have been made. And then the most terrifying 5 words in the English language, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and in their foolish hearts were darkened. We use the word foolish in the Bible. It's not an insult as such. The Bible says that the beginning of wisdom, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that a fool chooses to not fear God. A fool says in his heart, there is no God. So it's a syllogism or a tautology or an analytical truth or however you want to call it, but it's simply a definition. A fool in the Bible is just someone who rejects God and says there is no God. And so when you see that word, then you have an understanding. I've given you reasons to reject God. And there are more, but we don't want, in our sort of natural sense, we don't want there to be a God. We'll go to all kinds of lengths. Atheist scientists will go to great lengths to come up with arguments to prove somehow that there is no God. They don't want there to be a God. Science is not pure. It's driven by motives. For the mind that is set on the flesh, that is at the natural level, is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. There's a gap. So we said there are ways to not. there are ways that we can't get God back. Let me talk about the way that the romance nonfiction actually ends. Because God so loved the world that he gave his Son to redeem those who would believe on him so they would not perish. And who are these people? Those who would recognize God's sovereignty and put aside all of the things they would rather have and just recognize the reality of God's sovereignty and turn back to God in repentance. Repentance is another way from word for turning away and turning toward. And a relationship through Jesus Christ. Why? Because Jesus Christ is the only one who could get through the goalposts. He lived a perfect life. And he is, as he says to us, he said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. It's not about religion. It's about a relationship with the one person that can provide for redemption. Or not. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man. There is that word, a person who rejects God, who builds his house on the sand, just like those goalposts on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against their house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. I've talked about dread. I've talked about God consciousness. I've talked about what it means to not have the peace that surpasses all understanding. That's my invitation to you tonight. My invitation to you tonight is to allow yourself to once again, I've talked about sensus divinitatis, and it's kind of a funny, it's like, well, my sensus divinitatis got torqued tonight. I mean, it's kind of a strange way of saying it, but your God consciousness is something that you need to attend to. And so you can say the prayer, why are you cast down, O my soul? And why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. You have others in your life that are followers of Christ. If you would want to attend to that, not only exists, but God invites. And at some point then, on Christ the solid, no other ground is sinking sand. All other ground is sinking sand. Thank you.